Today I bring you Tina Strawn. We have not met in person, but we will be co-leading a legacy trip in 2020, in June of 2020, to Montgomery, Alabama, and I'm thrilled about her work and this conversation about grief and liberation. Tina has been a fitness professional for over 14 years and started working out and teaching group fitness classes as a way to deal with her mother's death from non-Hodgkin's lymphoma in 2005, and as a way to take care of herself and find sanity in the midst of being an overwhelmed body, insecure working mother of 3 kids. Tina's hobby of teaching classes turned into a career, and she held many regional and corporate positions for companies such as LA Fitness, Lifetime Fitness, and Anytime Fitness, where she oversaw hundreds of department heads, studio managers, yoga coordinators and teachers, group fitness instructors and indoor cycle instructors, and personal trainers across Texas, Oklahoma, Georgia, and Alabama. While teaching fitness classes gave Tina a stage and a microphone and a platform where she has taught thousands of people, it didn't give her a voice. It was only after watching the videos of Elton Sterling and Philando Castile being killed by police in July 2016 that Tina found her voice. And it was only after reading Brian Stevenson's book, Just Mercy, that helped Tina understand what to do with her voice. At the intersection of her fitness teaching and her activism, Tina created 3-day anti-racism and yoga trips called Legacy Trips, formerly known as Satya Yoga Trips, where participants go to the Lynching Memorial and the Legacy Museum in Montgomery, Alabama, and use the practice and philosophy of yoga as tools to dismantle racism. Tina has led 6 of these trips since December 2018, and she will lead 6 more trips in 2020. Tina has recently retired from her full-time fitness career and is now a full-time anti-racism educator and facilitator, and a social justice advocate and activist. In addition to leading legacy trips, Tina also leads online webinar and live workshops, and she offers individual and organizational anti-racism coaching and consulting. Tina is also the co-host of the Speaking of Racism podcast, and she travels and hosts screenings and discussions of HBO's documentary, True Justice, Brian Stevenson's Fight for Equality. Tina comes into the work first and foremost as a Black queer woman, having lived her entire life in the U.S. She teaches and learns and facilitates through the lens of Black feminism and critical race theory for the purpose of Black liberation. In our conversation, we talked about justice and equality. We talked about truth-telling and the power of working with history and honoring history and being truthful about history. We talked about healing and how our work related to anti-racism work, which is sort of everything, is grief work. And I'm thrilled that you'll get to hear her. Enjoy the interview.
Thank you for saying yes to being part of this conversation about grief and liberation. I'm glad you're here.
I'm glad to be here. Thanks for asking me.
Mm-hmm. And I'm going to invite us to start with a moment of centering before we dive into the conversation. So you can find a comfortable way to be in your body, and people watching or listening can find a comfortable way to be if that's possible right now. And take a moment to turn your attention to your breath and begin to feel your inhales and exhales. And take a moment to notice how you feel. Notice any physical sensations or emotions. And now take a moment to turn your attention to your heart space, your heartbeat. And notice what you're holding in your heart. What is present in your heart right now? And take a few more deep inhales and exhales here, just being with your heart. And then as you feel ready, if your eyes are closed, you can blink them open or look up if you were looking down, and just reorient to the space. So, Tina, we have not met in person yet. That's going to change in June. I've been following your work, though, on social media for a while. And I'm really excited that you're here and excited about the work you do in the world. And I would love for you to share some about what you do in the world, the work that you do.
Well, thank you. First of all, I am honored to have found my voice and to now be using my voice in a variety of ways that help to bring education and awareness to anti-racism work. And that involves me speaking, teaching, facilitating, coaching, consulting, and advocating with regards to helping people to identify, understand, and dismantle racism and white supremacy. And I do that by first showing up in this work as a Black woman and then as a yoga teacher. So I do this through the lens of yoga practice and philosophy, as well as through the lens of critical race theory and Black feminism. So that's what I do. One of the primary things that I do in my work is lead legacy trips. And that's what I know you're going to be joining me for. So legacy trips are 3-day anti-racism and yoga trips where we go to the Lynching Memorial, which is more formally known as the National Memorial for Peace and Justice, and also the Legacy Museum from Enslavement to Mass Incarceration, both in Montgomery, Alabama, where we use the practice and philosophy of yoga as tools to dismantle racism. So that's a little bit about what I do in the world.
Thank you for sharing some about what you do in the world. And I remember when we were talking maybe a week or two ago about me joining you for one of the legacy trips, I said something about this being grief work, that's how I frame dismantling racism work or skill and action work. And I think what you're creating in the legacy trips certainly feels connected to grief and acknowledging history. And so I'm wondering why you feel like it's important to acknowledge history, to grieve, to be having this conversation now, given what's going on politically and culturally. Why is it important to talk about grief and liberation or acknowledging the harm that's happened right now?
So I think that we are currently living in a society in the United States where people are experiencing grief and not having a name for it, not understanding. So I think we are in a time where people are asking a lot of questions. They are noticing and seeing the shifts that are happening socially, politically, racially. And I think many of us, I include myself in this, many of us for the first time. I think about you, Michelle, and how you have been doing this work for many, many years. Whereas I am among those people who had a more recent awakening to the harsh realities of the continued rampant injustice and racism in our country. So I think it's important for us to talk about this now because we are seeking answers for these questions. I think we're finding ourselves in a country that we didn't understand before. I think we are awakening to the realities of this is not or rather, I don't feel proud of the red, white, and blue in the ways that I did when I was a student in elementary school and saying allegiance to the flag. I have since, watched the culture turn into where we are, and I now do not feel connected to the ideology of settler colonialism and not understanding that that's what it was, not understanding that the revisionist history that we have been taught and raised on, that created in us a falsehood. It created tremendous dishonesty in us. And so we have found ourselves facing some recent events, and I'll kind of talk about some of those events for me. But I know for many people, whether it is having experienced the loss of Black life at the hands of police and law enforcement, whether it has been the presidency of Donald Trump, there are so many people that are having this awakening and this, how did we get here? This isn't what I thought it was. We gotta fix this. What can we do now? So the question being, we are acknowledging, we've come to a place where we acknowledge this is not what we thought it was. We have been living in some whitewashed version of what we hoped to be or what we thought we were. Then to realize and have some moment that shifts all of that for us. And now we're saying, and we first feel that grief, right? So for me, the grief has been about the loss of what I thought this was, and the loss, the acknowledgement, the reckoning of we aren't so much further along, or we're not as further along as we thought we were, or as we think we are. And then saying, what do I do with this now? So we're feeling that, we're feeling it. It's coming up to the surface. We're no longer able to deny it and stuff it down. We're seeing it, and we're asking questions. We want healing. We want to move from this, past this, but kind of to what you mentioned, we're not able to until we face history. So I think that's why it's so important now to be doing grief work and talking about it.
Yeah, I appreciate what you said about awakening to what is, right? And that happens at different times for different people. And so I'm wondering for you what that moment was, because you talked about that sort of transition, and then that actually changed the work that you do in the world, right? Which I'm sure was always in you and like present, and this awakening brought it forth. And so if you wouldn't mind sharing some about that moment, I would love to hear about it.
Absolutely. So the shift for me was July of 2016, where I have, just background about me, I have spent my 14-year career as a fitness professional. So I have been a corporate manager for large fitness corporations, national fitness corporations. And in that work, I've been a teacher. So kind of to what you said, yes, my work this has always been in me, but who it was directed towards and what the intention behind it was different. So while I am doing my work in fitness and living a very distracted reality, I'll say, I accidentally was scrolling through Facebook one day, and I saw the videos of Alton Sterling and Philando Castile being killed by police. And in those moments of watching those videos, I knew that I would never be the same, and something inside of me broke. And it was me coming face to face with the harsh realities of what it is and what it means to be Black in America in a way that I had not been able to connect with before. So for me, in those moments, as I observed, as so many people did, because those videos were available back in July 2016, that was the loss of this ideology of what America was and who I was in it. From that, a few months later, Donald Trump would become president. And I know that's also part of your story as well, as you share in the book. And as so many other people's story, that we just have had this moment of terror, or just this moment of where do we go? What do we do? This is as bad as it's gonna get, And of course, having now lived through 3 years of this presidency and recognizing all that has brought up, right? It's a matter of, we allow those moments to hit us, and it shifts something inside of us, and then we begin to ask ourselves, what now? Why does it matter? And so that is what began and brought me to recognizing that there is more to my work in using my voice. So I kind of, in the moments of watching Alton and Philando being killed, I found my voice. It broke me, and it enabled me to recognize that we have to use our voices on their behalf and on the behalf of so many others. And if we want and have and hold this desire and this hope for a different world, then we have to show up differently. So that's where it started for me.
Thank you for sharing that. And as you referenced, I did have a similar experience. And for me, it was when George Zimmerman was acquitted that I'd been leading anti-racism training. So I was awake to racism and my place in America, and something shifted in that moment. Though it was like, I don't know, as you said, something broke. That's how you felt, and that's how I felt. And I'm not sure if that was a new awakening or just deepening of understanding of the mess we're in. I don't know. I still haven't figured out, because I was well aware of racism and its impact on me. And again, something definitely shifted in that moment, and deep grief came up for me in a way that was like, I'm not going to be able to be put back together. So it felt like a shattering, and then trying to figure out how to put myself back together, or a new form of who I am. I guess maybe that's what happened.
And I think your language around that, it was a shattering. Like I reference it as I was broken, and you just used the word shattering. Like, and I appreciate you saying that you have been doing anti-racism work and leading this for many, many years. So you have that awareness and that knowledge, and but to face it in this way, and to face it with Trayvon, to face it with Alton and Philando and all of the other names, is a deepening of the grief, I heard you say. Mm-hmm. So yeah, that is, and I come across that in my work so often when I ask white people in particular, what was it for them that brought them to their awareness of their own privilege? And what was it for them that caused them to say that they want to participate in dismantling racism and being a part of justice work and healing work? And for so many, it has been these stories, and watching Black men, women, and children being killed by police, and then to continue down that, and for there to be no accountability, no consequence to the taking of Black life. And so it's those moments that kind of raise the veil, kind of let us see behind the curtain, and we can no longer continue with this false sense of reality or a false sense of safety. So I think that's what it was for me. Obviously, being Black in this country, always being aware of racism, knowing about it, having experienced it in those covert ways, but seeing those killings and living through all of the acquittals that we've seen since, realizing this is not the America that we want to be a part of. This is the America that we can see needs to change, and we want to be a part of that change.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Are there any lessons from your experience of grieving, and it can be specific to the awakening you shared earlier, but any lessons that you've learned from grief that you want to share with people watching or listening?
Grief has taught me that it will not kill me. Grief has taught me that it's there. I have to say that when you first asked me to be a part of this conversation to talk about grief and liberation, it's interesting because I do believe that my work is liberation work and healing work, but I haven't considered it grief work. So, of course, in the weeks that have taken place, the past couple of weeks, as I've really sat with this and really dug into grief. What does my grief look like? How does my grief show up? How do I care for myself in this grief work. And it just hasn't been something that I've thought about, but I'm so grateful that you brought this conversation. It's so necessary, because I think that what people are feeling and experiencing being grief and not putting that language to it, right? We often make connections to grief being the process of what we go through after a loved one dies. And we seem to sometimes compartmentalize it there, and because that's absolutely what it is. But what I don't think we allow for ourselves to acknowledge is that grief is a loss, and that's a loss in so many different ways. So as we are working to liberation, that process that takes us from grief to liberation, that in between is the healing. So those, I consider myself, you consider yourself, we are doing healing work, but let's slow down and go back and understand and identify and acknowledge that grief is present. So that's what I've learned most of all, is that it's not going to kill me, and that it's there, and I can choose with what to do with it. And I have to make a decision as far as, how do I honor it? Is there an honoring that can happen, that can take me, that can be a part of my healing process? Is acknowledging the grief and honoring the grief, holding space for the grief, being in it, and not being so quick to run away from it, right? When we get into, we talk about suffering, being so quick to want to be on the other side of suffering, and not being willing to sit with it and understand that there is work to do here. There are lessons to learn here. So that's one of the biggest things that I've learned, is that grief is a part of healing and liberation work. For the first time, a few weeks ago, a friend of mine asked, and I'll share about her because she's going to be one of my co-leads coming up, or rather a guest, Rebecca Baruchi. She's an author, she's a meditation guide, and she's going to be leading meditation sessions on the trip coming up in February 14th through 16th. And she's never been to Alabama before. She lives in New Jersey. And we were talking about the legacy trips. And she asked me, she said, I've never been to Montgomery before. I've never been to Alabama. Do you ever get scared? And I thought in that moment, no one has ever asked me if I am afraid. And so I sat with that. And I said, I don't get, I have not experienced fear with regards to the kind of, it is the South, it is the deep South. It is home to so much of what we know, Montgomery being a primary place of where the transatlantic slave trade was happening, right? There hasn't been a fear. There has just been an awe, really, if anything. I mean, which is I'm not afraid. But I also understand at the same time is that when I go for the purpose of leading these trips, I have a particular role that I believe has been given to me. I believe I've been called to this work. And so in the work, I believe that I've been prepared. I am supported in being in those spaces with the people that are attending the trips, to hold space for them as they come into this awareness and have these awakenings and these realizations as they face the truth of our nation's history and past of racial violence and racial terror, and present racial violence and racial terror. And in that, it's as though my grief and my fear is suspended and compartmentalized for when I come back, and when I then take care of myself and go through my own rituals and practices to take care of myself so that I can go back and do it again.
Yeah, that what you just named leads me to the next question about ritual and practice. And you mentioned earlier, just thinking about, once you thought about the work you do as healing and grief work, thinking about, how do I take care of myself in this, right, as I do it? And I'm wondering if there are rituals or practices you engage when you do your work. So whether it's grief work or healing work, which are kind of one and the same, because both of those things are alive in the spaces that we're in and creating or co-creating. Can you share some about practices or rituals that help you stay grounded?
Say this first, that I've been pretty reluctant and hesitant to use the term spiritual practices. And that has to do with my background. I was raised very conservative, evangelical, fundamental Christian. And so I have a background and I have a foundation as far as my childhood where what we are allowed in our religion is very narrow and restrictive, that in the way that I was raised. And so it sounded almost blasphemous at first when I started to hear the term spiritual practice, because it didn't sound like Christianity, which is my upbringing. So all of that to say, I will never forget when I first really understood the term spiritual practice several years ago, when I was at the intersection of getting out of fitness full-time, getting out of corporate management. My mentor, my fitness mentor, said to me as I was telling her, I want to quit this. I've been doing it for this many years and it's no longer bringing me joy. And I have found my voice and I want to use my voice in a different way. What do I do? And she said to me, the first thing she said is that you need to get a spiritual practice. And I didn't know what that meant 100%. And this was 3-4 years ago. Didn't understand what that meant. But of course, as I would do my work and study and read and listen and learn and just dig in and spend time in meditation and stillness, I would begin to understand that I was already doing many spiritual practices. I already had some things in place. And so to come around, that's my long way of getting to some of my spiritual practices. And I think it's always kind of started with meditation for me. Meditation and stillness is foundational for me. I received my 200-hour yoga teacher training in 2012. However, I did it for career purposes, is what I will say. I did it because that was what was required in my position, in my role. And I needed to be able to hire yoga teachers, hire yoga coordinators, studio managers that have a background in yoga. I just had that, I had to be a part of my repertoire. So that is why I was like, well, I guess I got to take my ass to go do a 200-hour. And I did, but I wasn't in the mind frame and I wasn't in the headspace of receiving it, right? So I basically checked that box, got that 200-hour, went right back to not practicing yoga, really not teaching. It didn't come until 2016. And it didn't come until I then started to take classes from a local teacher in Atlanta, and I was seeking, right? So that goes back to something is changing. I'm asking questions. I'm identifying ways that this is not what I thought it was. What am I supposed to do? And so I began to find answers in my meditation. I began to find myself really in meditation. And I believe that, we all already have what we need inside of us. We just have to listen. And we have to, when we come to that stillness, we can experience ourselves in silence. So meditation is a part of it, big part, daily practice, as well as following the other 8 limbs. Other things that I do, gospel music, which is interesting because I no longer have a relationship with organized religion or with any particular church, or I don't currently observe any particular religion. However, what I have not discovered, because it's always been a part of my life, gospel music has been so, it is so a part of my world. It has been. I'm a preacher's daughter. So my grandfather was a preacher. My other grandfather was a deacon in the Baptist church. So church is just a part of life, always has been. And so when I connect to the music is separate from the theology, is separate from the doctrine. The music brings for me and opens me in a way that I feel connected to something bigger and something more. So I was sharing with my wife the other day because she's starting to ask more questions about a spiritual practice. And I said to her, when we turn on our Fred Hammond, or we turn on our Kurt Carr, or Tri-City Singers, Donald Lawrence, all of these older, I say older, it's not that old, but just some of the gospel music that we grew up with, the Winans and BB and CC and all of the, like, that is a way that we tap into something bigger than us. So that's another part of it. But that's been surprising because I've had some hesitation with, is it okay for me to still have this deep relationship with gospel music when I don't have a relationship with the foundation, with the Christian church, or with this particular theology? And absolutely, you know, it is joy filled for me. So it involves also for me something that is new-ish to me in honoring my ancestors, connecting with my ancestors. And I say newish in the sense that, you know, last year, so September 2018 was around the time that I believe that this work of legacy trips and this vision was given to me. And it is the understanding and the awareness that it has been given to me. This isn't me sitting down at my kitchen table saying, I'm going to have a business plan and put together this idea. This really was, okay, you've been teaching yoga. You've been already in spaces where you've been leading. You've already been in spaces where you are responsible for facilitating these types of conversations that can be challenging. They haven't been about race and justice issues, but it has been in this more, again, corporate setting. So now all of that work that you've done in your 14-year career as a regional manager in this space over here, that all is going to shift. And we're going to give this to you because this is now the work that you have to do in this time where people are hungry and needing direction, needing answers, needing to know how to find them, needing to understand that they have to identify and give space to and give voice to their grief, needing to know, what does healing look like? What can healing look like? Wanting to be a part of imagining liberation, right? And creating that vision of liberation. Because I believe that what you and I are working towards, and everybody that's a part of the collective liberation movement, we are looking for something that doesn't exist, has never existed. And so we are on the path to create that. So all of that to say, my spiritual practices, have looked like meditation, gospel music, connecting with my ancestors, and knowing that I am able to do this work and be in this work every day. I've gone at this point to Montgomery and to the Lynching Memorial and the Legacy Museum 7 times. And I've got 6 more ahead of me in 2020. And I don't know what 2021 is going to bring, and I don't have to, but I know that my ancestors have given me this, and I don't have to worry about all of that later. I just know that I am here to do my work and to listen to them, be led by them, be strengthened by them, and just continue to decide to show up. So yeah, the ancestor honoring and worship is new for me, but that's also part of a spiritual practice that I lean on.
Yeah. When you were talking about the gospel music, I remember I grew up Baptist, and the music is the main thing that I remember from that experience, because there was dissonance going on, because I was aware that the minister or preacher was talking about, was othering people and doing the same thing that oppression had done to us in this Black Baptist church, but he was doing it with other groups of people. And I knew that as a child. Like, I was like, that doesn't make sense. That doesn't feel like that's divinity or what spirit would want us to do. And I remember like sitting there with dissonance, and then the gospel music felt like the vibration was shifting when I would hear it. It was like, it resonated so deeply. And I think there is a connection between that music and our ancestors too. Like, I think all of it's, like, music is meditation, right? That's one thing that you named that you practice is meditation, and then the vibration shifting, and then a connection to this music that's old, like it's been around and is part of, I think, our ancestors' resilience. And it was a communication system too, like allowed people to survive and figure out new ways of navigating and being. So I love that you talked about gospel music, because hadn't thought about that in a long time. But I definitely remember that as a kid, for sure. So you mentioned collective liberation and a collective liberation movement, and I'm wondering what collective liberation means to you, like either what it means or what it might or could look like.
Collective liberation for me means our equality being attached to our humanity. And that goes beyond racial lines, gender lines, ableism line. It extends to all of us. So when I say collective liberation movement and the work that we are trying to do, right, for all of us to be free to be, right? And I sometimes struggle with the word and the term rights for us to all have the right to, right? And just, I'm still working around and putting together rights versus privileges. It is simply our ability to be, our presence to be and show up as we are in whatever that looks like. And in that, and being connected to humanity. So we have only seen domination on this planet. We've only seen oppression. So when and then we bring it down to this country and what we envision and work towards. Our nation has never been separated from white supremacy. It's never been separated from patriarchy. So when I say that we are imagining something that hasn't existed, we are being futuristic, we are being, we're using our imaginations to see the world in a way that it's never even been. We haven't even seen it. And that is what's exciting for me. We don't have something to point to and say, collective liberation looks like back then, right? Like when we talk about, when they say, make America great again, we can't point to that. There's nothing that we can point to say we want it to be like that. And that's what it means for me to be a part of this movement and this work, is creating something that hasn't happened. And it's all based on our humanity.
Mm-hmm. I love your clarity about that when I first asked the question, like equality and humanity, like when those things meet up and are aligned, right? And also the idea that, well, it's not just an idea. I think it's a fact that we haven't experienced collective liberation yet. So of course we don't know what it might look like, and we have to dream that and imagine it together. So I really appreciate the way you think about collective liberation, and certainly that's what you're doing and the work you do in the world. And I'm because I think the work that you're doing is healing, and it's grief work and it's liberatory work. I'm wondering what you think it could look like or would look like for culture to prioritize spaces for us to grieve and acknowledge in the way that you're setting up space. Like what conditions need to be in place for more spaces to be created like the ones you're creating? What needs to happen in culture for that to happen? Because you're creating really powerful healing spaces.
Truth telling. I think it's got to start with telling the truth. And I defer to the work that I do in particular and the ways that I have been influenced by Bryan Stevenson. And, and to share with the listeners, not knowing or assuming that everyone knows who Bryan Stevenson is. Bryan Stevenson is the founder and director of the Equal Justice Initiative. He is an author, an activist, a social and justice, racial justice, civil rights attorney for many, many years. And it is the Equal Justice Initiative, which has a goal of working with and helping the wrongly accused, those on death row, and those who have been given life sentences, in addition to young people, children who have been given life sentences. This is who the Equal Justice Initiative works with. Bryan Stevenson wrote a book called Just Mercy. That book became a movie. So I think that movie starring Michael B. Jordan and Jamie Foxx is out in theaters now. And one of the things that Bryan Stevenson talks about as he goes around the country and that as he focuses on his work is that we've got to come to this place where we're telling the truth. We've got to tell the truth about who we are. We've got to tell the truth about what created the nation that we have. And in telling the truth, that is what brought him to create and brought the Equal Justice Initiative to create the Lynching Memorial and the Legacy Museum. Because there is no space on the planet other than these two places, the memorial and the museum, that exist for the sole purpose of acknowledging and honoring and remembering all of the lives lost of African American men, women, and children due to racial terror and violence at the hands of white supremacy. And we have to tell the truth about that. And when we are not willing to tell the truth about that, that prevents us from being able to see the ways that the foundation of our nation have been set up and how that still informs what we experience today, what our legal system looks like, what law enforcement looks like. And so I think that's where it starts. It starts with us being willing to truth tell and acknowledge history, learn history, understand history. At the Lynching Memorial, there are monuments of over 4,400 Black men, women, and children, at times entire Black communities that were lynched. Between the late 1800s and 1950, I believe, is the time frame. And of course, having monuments that represent over 4,400 individuals, but we know that that number is much greater. There's not a way for us to know all of the names, all of the lives lost. So there's no other place that exists, which is why Bryan Stevenson and the Equal Justice Initiative said there needs to be a place where all Americans and everyone can come and bear witness to and acknowledge, remember, honor the lives lost, and now what we do with that. So understanding that there are, we talk about the Confederacy, and we talk about the monuments and the things that are up that still celebrate the Confederacy. And there being arguments about what if we leave the monuments and put next to them memorials of the Black men, women, and children who lived in the community, and put next to the truth about what was happening with regards to how white supremacy allowed and does allow for our towns and for the Civil War to have shaped where we are today. What if we have these acknowledgements side by side? What if we don't erase? That's an ugly part of our history. It is painful, and it is offensive, and it is triggering to see Confederate flags and Confederate monuments and buildings and things like this. But what if we allow for the truth of that happened, and we put next to it, here is a monument that represents enslaved peoples that were brought to work this land to produce the nation that we have. So to start there, I think one of the number one things that I get, number one responses I get from the people that come on the trip with me is that they didn't know. I think that's powerful. We go through our school years, our primary years in school learning history. What are we learning if, as we are in our 40s and 50s and our 60s, and we're coming to Montgomery, Alabama, and we're walking through this memorial and we're going through the museum and we're tracing history from enslavement to mass incarceration, and people's reaction and responses, I didn't know. You know, we heard about the Montgomery bus boycott. We know about Dr. King. We know about Coretta, and we know about Rosa Parks. You know, we know about some, you know, very a very small piece of history. Why don't we understand how how racial oppression, why don't we understand that injustice and white supremacy, and why don't we know that that is the fabric of the nation? Because if we don't know that, we can't tear it down, and we can't imagine something greater. We can't imagine that collective liberation. So how do we go about having these conversations and creating a space for both grief that leads toward liberation? We start facing the truth and telling the truth.
I agree with you. Yes, we need to tell the truth, or we can't. We're just replicating patterns over and over, and some of the not knowing, I feel like, is by choice, and some of it is how our institutions condition us. Like the institution of education doesn't teach us, right? We have to seek out this learning, or it needs to be passed down through family or through story. So yeah, we need to start telling the truth. And I have a friend, her name's Stephanie. I'm going to interview her for this. She'll always say, are we going to tell the truth? Like, is today the day we're going to tell the truth, before she starts talking? And I love it, because it's like, she's saying, are we going to deny, lie, pretend, or are we going to tell the truth in this moment? And I think it's such a powerful, it's like funny when she does it, but it's also real. Like, are we going to be real in this moment?
It's so real. It's like I want to walk in it. I love that. I can't wait to listen to her, your interview with her, because it's like we are at that place where it's like, okay, we need to walk into every room and just say, what are we going to do here? Are we going to just keep going on business as usual? Or are we going to actually get the truth?
Right.
That is what excites me and brings me joy, is that when we start telling the truth, that's how we get free. That's how we heal. That's how we find our humanity. That's how we connect to it. And so I can talk about this for hours. I'm sure you can too.
Yes. I would love for you to share how people can connect with you and what's coming up in 2020.
Wonderful. I'm happy to share that. So I invite people to go to my website. Go to legacytrips2020.com. And this year we are hosting 6 trips. And the first one is, as I mentioned earlier, February 14th through 16th, with Rebecca Barucki leading meditation sessions, and also with my co-host of Speaking of Racism, Jen Kinney, will be there as well. So we'll be doing some podcasting from the trip and from Montgomery. Then we have a trip in April, and then, Michelle, you're joining us in June. So Michelle will be there, and you'll be leading a skill and action workshop while we're there. So that's exciting. And then, you know, I have it set up intentionally that there are 6 trips during the year. And I tell people I do that so that people don't ever say, oh, I'd love to go, but I can't make it that date. Darn, sorry, too bad. And I get to say, guess what? There are 5 other dates. So pick one. Because I want it to just be something that people can, if they have a desire to go, then look at your calendar, look at the year, and figure out when's a time that you can make the commitment to go to Montgomery. So that's how they can find me. All that to say, legacytrips2020.com. And feel free to follow me on Instagram. My Instagram is Tina_Strawn_life. Follow me at the Speaking of Racism podcast, where I am the owner of that. That's been a new shift that we've taken with that podcast platform. So they can go to speakingofracism.com. They can follow us on Instagram and Facebook as well there. Yeah, I think those are the ways to find me, and that's what I have coming up. Oh, one other thing that I have coming up. If you see, I'm wearing my Just Mercy shirt. One of the other things that I do, because my work is so focused on the work of the Equal Justice Initiative, is I have obtained the rights from HBO to post documentary screenings and discussions of their documentary, which is called True Justice, the story of Bryan Stevenson. So I travel across the country and I host these discussions. Sometimes it's just an interactive discussion with those in attendance, and other times it's a panel discussion where we talk about the documentary, we view it, and then we talk about it. And it is an opportunity for communities to come together and have conversations around how racial bias is baked into the criminal justice system and the legal system, and that coming from the perspective of Brian Stevenson and his work over 3 decades in the criminal justice system.
Yes, I want to talk to you about that more and coming to North Carolina to share the documentary and host a discussion. So we can talk about that offline, off Zoom. And I'm so excited to be co-leading the retreat, the legacy trip. I'm calling it a retreat. It's not a retreat. The legacy trip in June of 2020, and excited for the work you're doing and all of the change you're creating in the world. So thank you for being you and doing what you do. I think it's brave and it's not easy work. And I know it's more than work, right? You're being called to do this. And thank you for having this conversation today and talking about grief and liberation and all the things connected to grief and liberation. And I will certainly share your website and the ways people can connect with you with this recording on the webpage. So thank you for being here. It's good to.
Thank you for having me. I have to say that Skill in Action was given to me also. The book was given to me as September 2018, the vision of the trips. October 2018, I went to a training called Yoga, Social Justice, and Community Building, led by Dr. Chelsea Jackson Roberts and Shane Roberts over at Sacred Chill West in Atlanta. And that's where I heard of Skill in Action. And so then I immediately, of course, bought Skill in Action and I read it and I just was like, okay, well, she's already done all of her work. This is the blueprint. This is the, this is a foundational tool and resource. So I'm just incredibly grateful for the work that you do. And you've been doing it and just, thank you for holding space for all of those who came after you've been doing this, like myself, and we're jumping into this space saying we want to help, and your voice and your presence in this work, in this movement is just, it's meant a lot to me personally. So I had to say that. Thank you.
Thank you for saying that, and I appreciate you honoring me in that way. And I'm so glad that you got the book. You were gifted the book, right? You were given the information about the book. And I also love to say, because it's true that it's not just my work, right? It's like my ancestors' work. So just came through me. So know that it's their work, and I'm glad that it's impacting people in the way it is, and that it's meant a lot to you personally. So thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. So definitely, I appreciate the opportunity to share my story. Thank you.
Thank you.